Imagine living in broad daylight, surrounded by neighbors and grocery stores and well-tended lawns, and feeling every single day as though something unseen is watching, marking, and planning. Imagine phone threats at midnight. Imagine windows cut, pets unalived, gifts left with macabre notes. Imagine reporting these things to the police and waiting for them to happen again. For Cynthia James, that waiting stretched across years until it ended one June morning in 1989 with a body in the yard of an abandoned house, hogtied, with a stocking around her throat. Graffiti on the nearby fuel tank reading chillingly, "Some B-word died here." Tonight we follow Cindy's footsteps, some tangible, many contested. Through 7 years of torment, through an investigation that split opinion, and into a coroner's courtroom where the case's final verdict still tastes like chalk. This is Nightly Haven. Put on a warm sweater and turn down the lights. And let's walk the boundary between true crime and something a little stranger.
Fear tingles down your spine and hairs stand on end. Mysteries unknown and tales in the dark. Are you ready? Hello?
Now, Cynthia Elizabeth Hack, later Cindy James, and also known at times in records as Cynthia Makepeace, wasn't a stranger to ordinary life. Born in mid-1940s, she worked as a nurse, tended houseplants, and lived in Richmond, a suburb of Vancouver. Friends described her as capable and social. Her life, by most accounts, had been unremarkable till the early 1980s. She separated from Dr. Roy Makepeace in 1982. Not long after they split, Cindy's life, the mundane parts, began to fray. What followed was a catalog that reads like a catalog of fear. Smashed windows, strange phone calls, notes pinned to windshields with images of violence, fires set near the house, a unalived cat left in a yard, doors cut with glass cutters, and on at least one occasion, Cindy reported being physically assaulted, stabbed, and injected with an unknown substance. Over the next 7 years, she would report roughly 90 separate incidences to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Those weren't small claims. They were serious, repeated complaints that drew investigators' attention, and also bafflement. If you were to plot Cindy's life on a map of ordinary things, you'd see kitchens and hospital shifts and plants. But overlay the map with her reports, and the picture becomes a darker geography. Now, the harassment begins in public records with what might be called garden variety nastiness. Porch bulbs loosened, windows broken, threatening anonymous phone calls. But the pattern escalated. In one voicemail, a hoarse voice told her, "Cindy, dead meat soon." In another message, the caller spoke of selling drugs and of wasting the C word. On one winter's day in December, a note was left that read, "Merry Christmas," beside a photograph of a woman with her throat, the image smeared with red ink. On another occasion, someone pinned an unalived photograph to her windshield, a picture of an unalive person under a sheet. Then there were incidences that looked like the crime scene props from a horror film. Phone lines cut in multiple places, small fires set near the property, basements broken into and taped over, and the ghastly detail that would become a headline touchpoint. Objects and scenes that seemed staged to terrorize rather than to simply burglarize. In one disturbing turning point, Cindy claimed under hypnosis that her ex-husband had murdered and dismembered people, an allegation that to modern ears requires caution and context. Importantly, this was a claim made while undergoing a hypnotic session. It is unproven and highly controversial in terms of evidentiary weight. Still, it fed the anxieties swirling around her life. The rule with anonymous threats is to not let them rewrite your reality. But if the threats keep coming, repeated and escalating, reality begins to conform them. The RCMP investigated thoroughly and spent a significant amount of public resources on Sydney's complaints. Over roughly 7 years of the investigation costed an estimated $1.5 million. Detectives found things that suggested real intrusion, footprints, cut lines, damage, and they found nothing conclusive repeatedly. That inconsistency would prove to be the hinge of the story, compelling enough to make the case frightening and ambiguous enough to plant seeds of doubt. Now, not everyone who knew Cindy agreed on what was happening. Some friends and a few detectives believed her and spent their own time and worry on the case. One detective, Jerry Anderson, stood out as a respectful voice among those who listened carefully to Cindy's claims. Others in the RCMP, however, grew skeptical. Over time, the official sentiment drifted towards the possibility that Sydney was staging some or all of the incidences. Had she been a victim of an energized stalker, or was she, as investigators considered, fabricating or dramatizing the assaults? That is a painful line to walk in a story like this. Being skeptical is a necessary tool to an investigation, but when being skeptical hardens into disbelief without satisfying explanation, it leaves unanswered questions in families and communities. On multiple occasions, police surveillance reportedly yielded nothing. On other occasions, evidence hinted at intrusion. Blood in her car, cuts to lines leading to her house, details that kept the possibility of real, dangerous perpetrator alive. Friends arranged to stay with her. A tenant who shared part of the house made odd claims, and the community watched. The saga became not just Cindy's burden, but increasingly everyone's puzzle. Now, the final week of May of 1989 are where the plot thickens into tragedy. On May 25th of that year, Cindy disappeared. Her car was found abandoned in the Blundell Shopping Center parking lot. Groceries still inside, a wrapped birthday gift on the back seat, and blood on the driver's side door. Contents from her wallet were found on the ground beneath the vehicle. Those are the sorts of small, unnerving details that suggest an abrupt departure. People close to Sydney found the scene disturbing enough to report her missing right away. Days pass. Searching by volunteers and agency teams combined combed rivers, shorelines, and nearby parks. Then on June 8, 1989, a municipal paving worker named Gordon Starchuk was walking near an abandoned house at 8111 Blundell Road in Richmond and discovered a body lying against the blackberry brambles near the property. It was Cindy James. She was hogtied, and her hands and feet were bound behind her back. A black nylon stocking was wrapped tightly around her throat. Nearby graffiti in orange spray paint read, "Some B-word died here." A spray-painted line traced from the fuel tank across the yard and encircled her body. Inside the vacant house, the word "devil" had been sprayed on the wall. The house sat beside a busy street. It was the setting that made anyone who drove past that spot question whether something terrible and public-facing had just occurred there. When the body was found, the physical injuries raised immediate questions. Her hands were bound so tightly that one of her fingers had been scraped down to the bone. Yet the autopsy told a different, puzzling story. The post-mortem examination revealed elevated levels of morphine along with diazepam and flurazepam in her system, medications that can depress respiration and cause death in significant doses or when combined. The coroner's report in toxicology suggested a drug overdose consistent with the intentional or accidental intake. For some investigators, this supported the possibility that Cindy ingested or was given a lethal cocktail and that the scene might have been staged thereafter. The RCMP's position would eventually lean towards slide, or at least the death was not conclusively established as a homicide based on the available forensic evidence. But the physical tableau of the scene, hogtied, garroted, looking, stalking, bound hands, didn't look like a classic slide. To some observers, including members of Cindy's own family, her father publicly rejected the other conclusion and pressed for a more thorough inquiry. The coroner's inquest later that year and reporting around it would highlight the contradictions and the ugly little seams where evidence didn't fit neatly into a single explanation. This divergence between what the body looked like at the scene and what the toxicology suggested in the central riddle, either Cindy died elsewhere or her body was moved and arranged to look like a homicide, or she took the drugs and then in some profoundly troubling way became bound in place where she was found. Both possibilities are difficult. Both are plausible in different ways, and both leave us with questions that forensic science at the time either couldn't or didn't answer to everyone's satisfaction. In 1990, a coroner's inquest drew journalists and townspeople testimony, including police officers, neighbors, friends, and forensic experts. Some medical witnesses suggested that Cindy's death could have been caused by a combined drug intoxication, while some police testimony emphasized the lack of collaborating evidence for many of Cindy's reported assaults. The inquest provided a public airing of the case contradictions, but it didn't produce the sort of definite closure the family and many inside the community had hoped for. The verdict remained contested. Now, for the media, the story is split into two narratives. A woman allegedly tormented for years who may have been murdered, and an alternate narrative that suggested a troubled individual possibly fabricating harassment. Both stories sold headlines, neither fully solved the case. Crystallized in public memory were the image-laden details, the spray-painted line around the body, the devil's scrawl in the house, and the answering machine tapes. In the absence of a fully satisfactory explanations, programs like Unsolved Mysteries and later True Crime podcasts revisited the files, and for new audiences, the case took on the texture of folklore. Equal parts procedural mystery, psychological puzzle, and for some, an uncanny tale. Now, when you step back and weigh the known facts, a handful of theories stands out. Let's walk through them carefully, like a detective, but with empathy for the people lost in the headlines. 1. A real stalker or harassment campaign escalated into murder. Evidence for years of complaints, incidences that included broken glass, cut phone lines, and threats, blood in car, violent notes, images left intentionally to frighten. Investigators at the time found physical traces consistent with intrusion. For many, the notion of a real, persistent harasser who finally unalived Cindy is the simplest and sadly plausible explanation. 2. A sewer slide staged to look like a homicide, or a death by drugs followed by a staging. Evidence for toxology showing high levels of the morphine and benzos, the coroner's suggestion of combined drug intoxication, absence of definite evidence of a third-party assault in the forensic record. Questions linger, however, about why and how someone in that condition would be hogtied and bound so tightly that their fingers were scraped down to the bone. 3. Fabrication and self-inflicted incidents prior to death. Evidence for RCMP, skepticism in the conclusion that some incidents seem staged. Some investigators believe Cindy's may have fabricated or exaggerated incidences, in some cases allegedly staging them, which could indicate psychological distress or fictitious disorder. Critics of this theory caution that labeling victims as fabricators is dangerous and can obscure real threats. This theory also fails to explain certain physical evidences at the scene in 1989 that points towards external involvement. A conspiracy of harassers, including possible family or acquaintances. Evidence for or against. Over the years, suspicion fell into various directions. Ex-husbands, neighbors, no publicly verified evidence that confirms a conspiracy, but rumors and some witness statements during the inquest fed speculation. Again, these are proposals, not convictions. 5. Some stranger, ritualistic, or occult elements. Evidence for the graffiti reading devil and the painted circle around the body provided fodder for the occult theories, but investigators who examined the scene tended to emphasize the likelihood of human misdirection rather than a genuine ritual. In short, the scene's theatrical elements may have been intended to frighten or mislead. None of these theories fits perfectly. That uncomfortable mismatch is the core of why Cindy's case persists in public imagination. Now, Cindy's family never stopped asking questions. Her father disputed the sewer slide conclusion. Her sister, Melanie, and other relatives publicly lobbied for answers for years. The family even established a bursary in Cindy's memory, an act that channels grief into something enduring. Meanwhile, the RCMP's financial investment in investigating her complaints became part of the public conversation and, for some, proof of the seriousness with which police treated the case. For others, the lack of resolution amplified suspicion of investigative failure. Podcasts, documentaries, and magazine features returned to the file repeatedly. New generations encountered the story in bite-sized retellings. Each retelling reshaped public perception, sometimes sympathetic, sometimes skeptic. In the end, the case lodged in the community as something more than a headline, a cautionary tale about fear, doubt, and the complicated work of believing victims while testing evidence. There's a particular flavor to Cindy's story that nudges it towards the uncanny. The elements that pull on the paranormal imagination are plain: ominous, anonymous messages, graffiti invoking the devil, a painted line encircling the body, the sense that something orchestrated and theatrical shadowed her life. Those markers are storytelling magnets. They make the case into something more mythic than many other investigations. People like myth. It simplifies, but myth can also distort, and it can mask reality. Suppose just for a moment that there was no stalker. How do we explain near constant harassment? A body arranged theatrically and toxicology that tells a different story. Suppose that there was a stalker who unalived Sydney and then staged the scene to mislead investigators. Each possibility slips into nightmare logic. That's why the line between true crime and paranormal speculation blurs. The story gives people plausible openings for both rational and supernatural explanations. Our brains prefer stories with closed endings. Cindy's has none. So where does this leave us? Cindy James' death is, in factual terms, both resolved and unresolved. Resolved in that we have a body, an autopsy, an inquest, and official documentation. Unresolved in the cause, motive, and the who and the why are contested. The coroner's office pointed to combined drug intoxication. Family and many public listeners remain unconvinced. Detectives lean on being skeptical about many reported incidences, but Cindy's friends and some investigators believed her with their whole hearts. The tension between those positions has never been satisfyingly bridged. If you want the neat, definite ending, the file won't give it to you. But it will give you, if you listen closely, the sound of a life interrupted by fear, the rustle of unanswered reports, and the quiet ache of loved ones left with more questions than answers. If you found tonight's descent into Cindy James' story chilling, consider sharing it with someone who likes mysteries but respects the humanity behind them. If you're in the Richmond area and you remember Sydney or the summer of 1989, please tell the story, not as a rumor, but as a memory. It's memory and human testimony that sometimes pry open cold cases. Nightly Haven is made with candlelight, curiosity. We do. Subscribe if you like what we do, and if you have a tip, a memory, or a correction about this case, people close to the story deserve more than rumors. Keep a light on, and remember, sometimes the scariest things are the ones that keep asking the question instead of answering them. Have a good night, guys.